Hello and welcome. My name is Lindo and I'm the Director of the Waddell Fellowship, a leadership development opportunity for students at the University of Melbourne interested in sustainability. Today though, I'm going to be your host for our second climate conversation, Opposing Views and Rising Tides. We're recording today's panel on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay our collective respects to elders past, present and emerging as well. For those of us that have been working on climate change or even following along with all the news, 2020 was meant to be the year for climate action, the year for climate ambition. One global pandemic later though, and maybe this is going to be the year. This is going to be the year where we start to act on climate change in a way that changes the trajectory of our planet. 2021, it could be our time. All around the world, when you look, you can see different opportunities and examples of climate ambition and the momentum just building. From the UN's regional climate weeks through to President Biden's Climate Leaders Summit next month on April 22, which happens to be Earth Day. All of these events, some of which are being led by government, some of which are being led by non-government actors from businesses and communities alike, all feed into a really important meeting, COP26, the UN climate change negotiations that actually got delayed from 2020 to this year. And I know to some of you, it might just have sounded like I rattled off a whole bunch of different events where there's going to be a lot of talking, but where's the action? Where's the climate ambition? For me, these events and many others that I didn't mention, they're really significant, not just because of the commitments that are being made, but more importantly, the plans that are being developed, the plans that are being implemented as well. And when we start to drill into the detail, as we will today, we can then start to really ask the questions, are these plans ambitious? Are these plans aligned with what the climate science is asking of us, especially when we think about the IPCC's 1.5 degree special report that they released a few years back? Is this ambition and is this action going to be enough? And joining us today for our panel, we're actually going to be exploring a really important question. Where does Australia fit into all of this? So we have Dr. Anna Kosovac. She is an international urban policy and water policy specialist at the University of Melbourne. Some of her past background includes working with the C40, ICLEI, the Covenant of Mayors, so real deep expertise in all things local government. Joining us on the big screen, we have Richie Merzian, who is the Climate and Energy Director at the Australia Institute, a think tank. Prior to his role at this think tank, though, Richie actually spent a decade in public service, including as a former Australian government climate negotiator. So hopefully he'll have some good insider stories for us today. Next up, back in the room, we have Luke Menzel, who is the CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council. This is a non-profit membership organisation that's really helping to drive industry outcomes so that we can have a net zero economy. And lastly, we have Professor Jackie Peel, who is the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures, a new initiative at the University of Melbourne. I'm sure we'll learn a little bit more about that later. But Jackie is a specialist in international climate policy and has been a lead author on the IPCC before as well. So welcome to the four of you. Richie, let me throw to you with our first question. As someone that has probably gone to more than your fair share of all of these events, both with your government hat on and otherwise, can you tell us, what is this Earth Day Summit that's coming up? Is it just another event? Is it actually important? What does it signal? What does it mean for us in Australia?
This event is important because of who's hosting. So this is President Biden's Climate Summit for Leaders, and he'll host this virtual event, which he committed to before the election even, that he'd host an event for leaders within 100 days of coming to power. He came into power in late January. Hence why he's having it in late April on Earth Day. And the whole purpose of this event is to demonstrate America's newfound leadership on climate. If you recall, within a month of Biden coming to power, he committed to go 100% clean energy in the US's electricity sector. He's put a pause on fossil fuel subsidies, on oil and gas exploration licensing, so public land. He's gone all electric for the US government's car fleet. So you could say that President Biden has done more for climate in 1 month than Australia's coalition government has done in 8 years.
I'm glad you've said that.
Yeah. And with that momentum, he wants to demonstrate the US's leadership on the global stage. And his first foray will be the summit he's organizing on the 22nd of April. And his top envoy for climate change is John Kerry. He's a well-known entity. He was the former Secretary of State. He led the US negotiations on the Paris Agreement, and he's already traveled around the world spruiking the US summit. He was just in London talking to Boris Johnson, and together they said that they will push big emitters, i.e. countries like Australia, to do more. And that's important because Australia will be invited to this summit. All major emitters, the 17 biggest economies, will be invited, as well as some smaller countries. And the expectation is that countries will bring forward plans to do more, not just in the long term, but the short term, and the US will lead by example.
Yeah, that's great. Fun fact about John Kerry, we share the same birthday, which I think everyone just sort of needs to know. Climate action really aligns. I think you've already touched on it a bit, Richie, where you say it's not just climate leaders that will be invited to this. And, you know, maybe Australia doesn't deserve an invitation given some of the events we were not invited to last year, but it's also targeting really big emitters as well. Do you see the opportunity in the coming month for Australia to actually show up as a leader, or do you think we're still going to be there because we're a big emitter?
We're there by virtue of the size of our COP26 in November, but even in the lead up to other big meetings, the G7 that the UK is hosting and has invited Australia to in June will be another occasion to push that. The US will use its climate summit to announce its new 2030 target, which could be twice the size of what its 2025 target will be. So there'll be this push for Australia to then also follow, especially since Australia to some extent kind of copied the US's homework, adopted a very similar target, but gave itself a lot more time to actually meet it. So there'll be pressure on Australia to see what it can do more in the short term, and hopefully the Australian government's doing that thinking now.
Yeah, that's great. And I think if you're a glass half full type person, when you hear Australia's a big emitter, I also hear, Australia has a lot of opportunities and a lot of low hanging fruit options as well. I think some people would also reflect on the last 4 years of the Trump presidency with maybe there were some glass half full moments there. And I think what's clear with some of what Richie just shared with us is President Biden is trying to put the US back on the map, not just in terms of climate action, but also international engagement. One of, I think, small silver linings from the Trump years, though, is we really saw action being driven from other places. So, Anna, I guess I'd love to talk to you more about that. One of the things that always caught my eye was the We Are Still In coalition and the role of state governments and local cities as well. So could you share a bit more about that?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point about mentioning the We Are Still In movement. So it's basically a movement that have been set up by cities, businesses, incorporating universities and hospitals as well, basically all getting together and saying, we don't really care what the president has done in this. We still want to be able to commit to the Paris agreements and do something about it. So, and I guess the other good thing to note is that this isn't a new space for cities. So this is somewhere where for the last 2 decades at least, we've seen cities really take the global stage to try and to talk about a lot of issues that are of importance to them, and one of them is climate change. Often we see cities are right at the kind of that impact point of climate change. They're seeing that, you know, it happening to them. And an example of something that cities have done is C40, develop basically a city-to-city network where you've got, you know, around 80 cities involved in this, of some of the biggest cities in the world. And that makes up a quarter of the world's economy in just this group. And so we're not talking about, you know, small numbers here. And then I guess having a look at C40 as well as a, you know, city-to-city network allows a much more unified voice coming from cities as well in terms of this space. But more than anything, C40 have actually put out a report saying that 40% of the emission targets needed to meet the Paris agreements globally can be achieved by cities themselves, and that's by 2025. And so, you know, there's a lot of room for movement, a lot of opportunities in cities to be able to drive this.
That's really great. And I think there's something about the convergence of like the role of cities, the urbanisation and more people moving to cities as well, and how they sort of become a hub. Looking around Australia, do you think there are some learnings we can take from either cities in the US, or are we actually leading the way already?
Yeah, I mean, in Australia is highly urbanised, one of the highest in the world. We've got about 89% of our population living in cities, so it's quite big. And we do know that through our local governments is where we can take a lot of that sort of direct action, things like implementing energy efficiency in building regulations, for example, recycling, and, you know, a lot of these kind of real on-the-ground approaches, green infrastructure, all of that really makes an impact. And I guess when we look to the US has got very, very vocal mayors who are quite popular. I think that this is something that we look to as well. And I think that already Australian cities, Melbourne, Sydney, are doing a lot, and they're already part of things like C40. The great thing I think about city leaders in particular is the fact that they're not as partisan as a lot of political leaders. So there's a lot more scope for movement in climate change, which is traditionally a really political issue.
And I think there's something, again, also about our local politicians feel so much more local by default. We can reach out to them. They feel like people we could potentially convince of things if we're not happy with the way recycling's done and whatever else. I want to pick on some of what you mentioned with you, Luke. One of the other coalitions that definitely has caught my eye is the We Mean Business crew. Everything has to have the we as part of it. So I guess I'd love your thoughts on what the opportunities are for business and industry, especially around that energy efficiency measures en masse.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the trends that we saw play out under the Trump administration in the local government level and in the states, that was also playing out in the business community in the US. And I was lucky enough to attend the Climate Action Summit in San Francisco in 2018. There was another one in New York in 2019, and this was the crew within the US that were really keeping the dream alive. And it was, as you say, local governments, it was state governments, it was governors of both political persuasions, Republican and Democrat, but it was also business leaders, and often using those events to lay out those significant commitments to net zero and what they were doing within their own operations. And in a lot of ways, they created a bit of a drumbeat through the Trump presidency. It means that while there's probably a lot to be a bit depressed about on the international stage and the impact of that particular Republican president in the US, we didn't lose all the momentum, and there are green shoots there, and there is opportunities to pick up that momentum and build on it. Now, I guess that's what we're going to see President Biden attempt to do at the Earth Day Summit. And you saw similar things playing out here in Australia. So obviously we've talked about the leadership that's been shown by local governments. You've also got a lot of leadership being shown by state governments here in Australia on a bipartisan basis. So Victoria and New South Wales actually have very converging policies around climate and energy in this space, both putting in place renewable energy zones, both have very ambitious energy efficiency schemes, both have programs to work with business to improve their energy productivity and the like. So there's almost a bipartisan consensus emerging around the policy basket at the state level, as well as obviously a commitment to net zero emissions from every state and territory around the country. And then you've got the business community. The business community in Australia really stepping up over the last 2 or 3 years, really embracing this as an issue because they've got pressure from their customers, they've got pressure from their investors, and you know, in many senses, we have individuals leading these corporations in executive positions that just care about it and realise that they need to step up. And so, really interesting, similar dynamics in Australia and the US. And I think that when we think about the place that the federal government finds itself in at the moment, that pressure was already building in an Australian context. We know this is a very challenging issue for the federal government. I think they now almost find themselves in a little bit of a pincer movement between the pressure that's happening at the local and in the business community, and now the pressure that's being imposed by the international community. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out over the next 6 months.
I definitely agree with all those points that Anna and Luke are making about the importance of this momentum, the building in cities, in subnational governments, in business. I don't think it takes away, though, from the need for international leadership and leadership from our federal government. So, I mean, the Paris Agreement, which is the international agreement that we've set up for taking climate action, is a bit of an experiment because it says rather than setting top-down standards where we agree at an international level what should be done domestically, we're going to kind of leave it up to everybody to come up with their own beautiful 5-year plan for how they're going to get to the goals. And then when you extract from that federal leadership and federal government not doing very much on climate policy, what we've ended up with in Paris implementation so far, particularly in Australia, is having to rely on actions of cities, actions of subnational governments, actions of business.
Exactly.
And it does raise this question for us of how it all adds up. And I think that's a really important question to keep putting back on the table and to say, well, with leadership from something like the Biden summit, pressure on the Australian government to do more, that's a really important contribution to congeal all of these efforts into something that actually meets the temperature goals that we need to hit.
Exactly, because we're so far off base right now. Very recently, in the last couple of months, countries had to resubmit their NDC, so there's nationally determined contributions, this bottom-up approach. And I think I just want to clarify here, when we're saying the words bottom-up, we're not necessarily meaning grassroots, we're still meaning bottom up from governments. So it's governments that have to self-initiate. So in many ways, there still are leaders and, have many resources available to them. But the UNFCCC put out a synthesis report, essentially calculating if all of these plans do get implemented without any sort of disruption, say another pandemic, what are we actually looking at? And across the board, it was 3+ degrees of warming, which is so far off base of what the Paris Agreement was trying to do. And I think it then asks that question of, well, if we set this really lofty goal, we said that you could all do whatever it was that might make sense, but those plans, those commitments aren't adding up, where to next? And I think over the last few years, in the implementation of Paris, it feels as if it's either the federal government's leading or all these other actors have to sort of pull together and try to create some sort of collective impact strategy. And what I'm really curious in your thoughts on is, are we going to start seeing a different sort of shift soon with what President Biden is trying to do? What happens when you have leadership from the top, leadership from various other sectors of the community? Are there examples that we can look at? Has Europe been doing this well? What happens when people are actually all walking towards the same goal? Anyone?
I might have a go at that, Lynn, and I think that Luke's analogy of the pincer movement is apt in the Australian context. So we've seen a rather dreary history in Australian climate politics of moments of interest in climate change and then fading away, policies falling by the wayside.
It's a bit of a roller coaster.
I mean, it's often referred to as the graveyard of Australian politics where climate policies seem to go to die. So what is different this time around? I think it is the level of action that's being taken at all of these different levels. I think it's the fact that the market is moving and in fact is making inevitable a transition in terms of our energy systems, and that businesses are on board and seeing a business case for 1.5 degrees, which is the target that's set under the Paris Agreement. Just last year, the BHP, one of our major resource companies, released its Climate Change Report 2020. In September 2020, it released this report, and essentially it makes the case that 1.5 degrees is the best business case for its operating model. So it actually sees the interest from a purely market perspective, a financial perspective in meeting and addressing climate risks. So I think that's quite a different thing and perhaps creates, together with the international pressure, a different kind of environment that we might have had in the past. But interested to see if you think that also applies in the broader business sector.
Well, I mean, one would think that what the current environment we find ourselves in terms of the business community in Australia is an incredibly enabling environment for the federal government to act in this space, with major corporates making their own commitments that are well ahead of where the federal government has decided to go in terms of ambition around 2050. Then the Prime Minister has the opportunity to take that next step, confident that there's not going to be that backlash. In terms of, I think the risk piece has been really key. The Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures and that whole process of businesses really running the numbers and reflecting on what the impact on their business operations would be of runaway climate change has really focused the mind, right? And to go, okay, well, obviously we care about this. We've all got kids. We obviously want to bequeath a habitable planet to our children, but also by acting on this, we're also taking care of our shareholders and our long-term value proposition. So that's a pretty compelling case for a business. I think it's a pretty compelling case politically as well. But obviously we need a Prime Minister and a government that is prepared to make it. I'm very hopeful, I suppose, that the coalition government takes that next step of raising that ambition this year. Because the thing we've got to remember is that we're effectively a two-party system. We ultimately need the coalition government to go on this journey, right? Because the ping-ponging backwards and forwards between the different views of progressive and right of centre governments is incredibly unhelpful here or anywhere else around the world. And so, I know there's voices within that party room that really want to act on this, and I certainly hope that they win the day.
I think that's a really, really good point about, it's not even just the coalition, it's also, well, what's the opposition proposing as well? And we're just not really getting any of that from Albanese at the moment. And it's almost like, Albanese is just kind of trying to read the international room to see kind of where's everyone sitting on this. And I'm really hoping that Biden will actually, provide that kind of push that's going to kind of push him over the edge into doing something.
Yeah, and where will all of this land? And Richie, I'm going to throw our next question to you because, you're in Canberra, so you're sort of in that Canberra bubble. And I think anyone in the Canberra bubble always loves to guess when the next election is going to be, the moment the election night is over for the last one. And I think everything we're hearing says that maybe this year, maybe early next year. And I guess what potentially might come out of that? Will Labor bring a different policy platform to what they brought to the last election? Where are some of these opportunities for us to, I guess, see some of that ambition get translated, not just from what businesses are doing or being forced to do, but actually implemented and translated into policy?
So to give you a Canberra bubble insight, there really is sort of two different worlds. One, you have what coalition state governments are doing, and then you have what the coalition federal government is doing. So with the coalition state government, you have some of the most ambitious renewable energy plans in the country. In New South Wales, they're putting on 12 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's about the same size as what they're currently producing as electricity on a whole. In Tasmania, the Liberal government there are going to 100% renewable energy by the end of this decade. In Tasmania, the Liberals there are going to 200% renewable energy. So you really have two different worlds. And I think that it's a good example that coalition governments can also lead in this space. Just the federal government hasn't caught up yet. And we're also seeing the coalition Labor government decide on what they're going to be taking forward in their climate policies in their national conference this month. Their new climate spokesperson seems to be holding the line on their climate ambition and hopefully taking that forward. And so they're doing their homework, and hopefully we'll hear more from them later this year. But there really is a lot that is happening. It's a highly dynamic space. And with all these international events, you're going to see more and more pressure brought to bear on the federal government from the top, and then also from their coalition counterparts from the bottom.
Once we've made everything renewable energy, are there still ways we can reduce how much energy we're actually using?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting point. So we actually have to do both at once. So big fan of renewables. They're having an absolutely transformative impact on the emissions profile of our electricity sector in particular, and that will continue over the next decade and beyond. Really, the last decade has been like a comic book death battle between coal and renewables. I think that's largely over. I think most people in the community and in the political sphere accept that that's where the electricity system is going. But interesting to note that over the last 5 years globally, there's been more abatement achieved through energy efficiency improvements than through renewables. And that's not to talk down renewables. They've got a massive contribution to make, and they are making it. But it's also to note that getting more efficient and productive with how we use energy is absolutely crucial as well. And moving forward, if you look at most of the scenarios for decarbonisation in the energy sector, you've got energy efficiency doing 40 to 45% of the heavy lifting. Last time I checked, we don't spend 40 to 45% of our time talking about that. And that's largely because, well, there's a few reasons. Australians have really have a love affair with their solar panels. They can get their head around it. It's something they have a close personal relationship with, and it's relatively homogeneous, easy technology to understand. Whereas energy efficiency, you're talking about different opportunities and challenges in lots of different parts of the economy. Energy efficiency plays out differently in homes versus commercial buildings versus industry versus the ag sector versus the resources sector. And so it's a little bit more finicky in some ways, but it's still crucial to put all of those energy savings and cost savings and carbon savings together to get where we need to go. As Richie says, electrification is a massive part of that, and that's part of often the upgrade pathway for things like appliances. So we might be replacing a gas heater, for example, with one that is not just more efficient, but one that is electric, and that means that it's ready as the electricity system decarbonises to use that renewable zero carbon electricity. Really interestingly, in terms of the moment we find ourselves in right now, is governments around the world considering what that process of energy efficiency upgrades and electrification look like in terms of their recovery plans. And there are many governments around the world, particularly in Europe, but also in Canada, that are investing heavily in building upgrades, for example, because it helps them on that journey in terms of their climate aspirations, but also it's just incredibly jobs rich. It's good stimulus, it's hardworking stimulus, and so there's a lot of reason to be thinking carefully about the role it plays, both in that long-term trajectory, but also in some of the immediate challenges we face coming out of COVID-19.
But Luke, that's really interesting, and I think that reminder of why renewable energies is really important, but also just energy efficiency as well. And the other thing for me that's fascinating about the electrification piece is what it means for all of the cars that we have on roads. So I know, Richard, you've been doing a bit of work on electric vehicles. Can you tell us more?
Sure. We've just been helping the Parliamentary Friends of Climate Action put on an event on transport. And a big part of that is really seeing why Australia is at the back of the pack when it comes to the uptake of electric vehicles compared to most other countries in the OECD. Or like, for example, Norway currently has about 70% of their new car sales are electric and hybrid and zero emission vehicles. In Australia, it's less than 1%. And whilst Australia is a car taker, not a car maker, and most car brands and most car manufacturers are moving to electric, right now most Australians are locked out of that market because electric vehicles are more expensive. And really, the benefit of uptake of electric vehicles will definitely help on the climate side, but it can also help in terms of reducing that household budget, about 14% that's spent on transport. So the opportunity would be, how do we bring down that sticker price? How do we incentivize affordable electric vehicle models to come to Australia? And to do that, that's the real space for federal and state governments to bring in incentives. But right now, we have a federal government that seems to be stuck in neutral right now. We don't have a single policy to help curb transport emissions, nothing to support electric vehicles. And unfortunately, in some states across the country, we have taxes that are coming forward specifically on electric vehicles, led by the Victorian Treasurer. So really, when it comes to transport, there's not much there, but there could be ways to actually lower our emissions and also lower those costs if we take that forward, because electric vehicles have cheaper fuel, they have cheaper maintenance, and with Australian government help, they could also have a cheaper sticker price.
And it really seems to me that there's lots of opportunities, but a fair few barriers and challenges that people have mentioned as well. How do we overcome some of those barriers and challenges? And Jackie, maybe you have some thoughts on what are some of the levers that actually make this moment different from all of the previous moments of climate optimism from before?
Well, I think we talked about some of the changes in the market before, but I think it's dangerous to sort of assume that we can then say the market will take care of it, because the consistent message that we get back from business and a range of other actors is actually they're looking for leadership, they're looking for policy direction, and they're looking for policy settings that provide the kinds of incentives that Richie's talking about in the context of electric vehicles, for example. So if you don't have the policy settings right, then sometimes the market's not sure which direction to turn. And you can also have unexpected consequences or adverse consequences without a really well thought through policy. And Luke was mentioning before that we're really moving away pretty quickly from coal-fired power into renewables, and that transition is occurring at a really fast pace. But we also know in Australia that we have communities that are set up around coal regions and have been for many years. So how do we manage that transition in a way that provides justice for those communities, decent work and employment, and so that everybody is brought along on that journey? So that's the social transition piece, the economic transition piece, and for managing that well, you need to have a good set of policies. There are great examples that are emerging overseas that we can look to. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And there's lots of expertise in the Australian government, in our local and subnational governments, who, if the minds are directed onto it, can really solve this problem.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits, right? Again, one of the small silver linings of being a bit slower to take action is there are so many great examples all around the world now that we could be looking at, that we could be replicating here, whether it's at the cities level, the state level, federal, business, communities and otherwise. I think one of the other things that we've touched upon a little bit is how some of what's happening in the US right now, we're definitely starting to see how people are shifting here. I want to look at some of our closer neighbours, even in Asia, where last year we saw some pretty big commitments around net zero goals from China, South Korea, Japan. Have you noticed in any of your work the impact that that has had either on business or government policy? I see you nodding, Richie, so over to you first.
I think this is really exciting what's happening in the East Asian markets. So yes, you have Japan and South Korea both taking on net zero by 2050. You have China with carbon neutrality by 2060. Now, those three markets, they import the majority of Australia's coal and the majority of Australia's natural gas. So by saying that they're going to go to carbon neutrality in the next few decades is like saying we don't want your coal and we don't want your gas over the long term, and we're going to start phasing that down. And in fact, it's already happened in China. And for Australia, as the largest coal exporter in the world and the largest LNG exporter in the world, that's a big deal. Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, according to our research at the Australian Institute, only behind Russia and Saudi Arabia. And you're already seeing the impact here with a lot more interest in alternative energy exports. And a good example is hydrogen. There's a lot of hype around hydrogen right now. As a potential export fuel, mainly because it's being driven by overseas interest. But it could also be a slippery slope. You can make hydrogen by using coal or gas, which is a really dirty way of doing it, or you can make it using renewable energy and water, which is a zero emissions way of producing it. So we're at a crossroads right now. Ideally, we invest in the green hydrogen pathway, but there's a lot of money and interest in taking it down a dirtier pathway as well. So whilst there's some good signs overseas that things are changing, we need to make sure that we actually align Australia on the right path to take advantage of the clean energy markets that are developing, rather than finding just another way to give a facelift to our fossil fuels and continue being a major fossil fuel exporter.
And I guess just adding to that, Richie, so I mean, there's all of this momentum to adopt net zero targets. But at the same time, those who are laggards are also going to be exposed to more questions around how they're producing goods that then go out into the international market. So there's a really strong research component that's emerging at the moment that's looking at the international trade implications. So what is the position for Australia if we don't adopt climate-friendly policies, and then we start getting penalised by nations in trade wars who say, well, actually, you're producing that in a dirty energy way that is less costly than the clean energy way that we might be using, and we're going to factor that in through taxes on the goods that come into you. So it's interesting to think about how that could also be a lever for action. Less the carrot approach and more the stick.
Exactly. And I mean, I think just again, last month we saw the European Parliament discussing something very similar to that around potentially imposing a tariff on any imports from countries that aren't that great on climate. And we are on that list of countries for sure. So it's something that we really need to consider, because one of my big takeaways from this conversation is, whilst it feels like there's a lot of opportunity, because so many other countries and sort of sectors in like business and cities are taking action, it feels like we're just playing catch up on every single level, and there's a few things that are maybe needed to come across to surpass some of those challenges. And you've touched upon it, Jackie, in terms of research. Can you tell us more about this new initiative, the Melbourne Climate Futures? Is that potentially a bit of a bridge that can help enable some of these conversations that need to be had?
That's certainly the intention, Lynn, because at Melbourne we have great climate research that goes across a range of different disciplines. But we really want to connect it up with the policy problems that are out there. So the intention of Melbourne Climate Futures is to create that link, and so that the research that's being done in many different disciplines, not just science and engineering, but law, humanities, geography, the areas that Anna works on, like connected cities, and connect that to the decision makers, to those who are trying to solve the problems in the real world, both at our local level, but also in our region and globally.
That's a really exciting initiative, and I can definitely see how some researchers who are, really established are going to feed into that. I think it's also important for us, though, to think about how research is being done in the first place, how we're training up our next, generation of leading authors on the IPCC and whatnot. So I guess, Anna, I'd really love to hear about your own experience and what you took as learnings in terms of going from your PhD to working with some of these groups that are implementing some of these policies. How did you find that?
Yeah, well, I think it was a fantastic opportunity to be able to work with organisations such as UN Habitat and C40, ICLEI, Chicago Council of Global Affairs. But one thing I did notice was how interdisciplinary all of this is. It's never just looking at, specifically, one discipline such as just the climate science. It's looking at, well, what are some of the social outcomes? Where are the economic issues that are coming into it? All of these other factors that are also surrounding this issue of climate change that also need to be considered. And even more so, that's actually what I teach actually in the Master of Environment. So, and I think that's definitely becoming something that people are starting to recognise a lot more.
And I think Richie and Luke, as people outside of higher education, what is it that you need from researchers? Like, what would be useful for you in terms of the outputs that, the Melbourne Climate Futures Initiative produces, so that you could either implement it in your work or use it as part of your advocacy?
So we often find ourselves at the intersection between research and business and government, and often feeding into policy discussions that governments are having in what we, I think, can all agree at this point in the conversation is a pretty contentious space. Policy making is hard, and often there isn't necessarily a good research base, and even if there's research in progress, it's not getting turned around rapidly enough to inform government decision making. What we often find is that, a 3-year PhD, while it's really useful, the caravan has kind of moved on by the time they've finished exploring that research question, which I think poses a real challenge for the tertiary sector as we deal with what we all agree is an existential threat. One that will require a huge amount of decision making and well-informed decision making, particularly over the next decade. How do we identify those questions, work them up into a form where universities and other experts can feed in rapidly to make maybe not perfect decision making, but the best decision making we can at a given point in time, so we can just keep the caravan moving forward. It's sort of like building the track in front of us as quickly as possible. It's kind of how we've got to think of it, rather than necessarily coming up with the exact perfect right answer in every instance.
It's the better practice rather than the best practice. And hopefully COVID and, the development of the vaccine and so much science being released even before it was peer reviewed, so that people would already start to discuss, well, what are the implications if this holds true? And if not, what are the implications then as well? So I think continuing to extend the robustness of conversations that happen in academia into industry as well. Richie, do you have thoughts on what do you need from researchers?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting one because we're a research think tank at the Australia Institute, but at the same time, we don't do academic research per se, and we don't necessarily look to submit our work in peer-reviewed journals. we do research that we can inject into the public discourse, either one that's already happening in Canberra or in state capitals, or ones that we hope to generate. And in that sense, we really do see research and communications go hand in hand, and we think about how that research will inject itself into that debate before we even begin. And that's why we also do a lot of polling, as well as well, most of us here are economists. So, which means that, for the 15 economists, we have about 16 or 17 views. So we see how we can use that to actually influence policy, because after all, that's the purpose that we see research for. And we want to work with more academic institutions to provide that primary research and see how we can actually lend it and use it to get the climate policies that we need.
And I think with initiatives like Melbourne Climate Futures, the appetite is there for researchers to say, actually, we want to have an impact on this problem, and we're prepared to work in slightly different ways, in more interdisciplinary ways, and with a focus on the end goal and problem. And I think one of the things that universities bring is a convening power. So bringing the stakeholders in the room to share views and back end that up with expertise, with evidence, can be a really important function, and that's something that we'd really like to bring into the space, which I know is already well populated with many different institutions like Richie's own, who are in that policy space.
And I guess this also brings back to kind of what Biden was trying to do in the US with his work on, their press release basically just after he got elected was all about, we need to bring back in science and evidence bases and, creating a whole committee just based on this, highlights, that this is an area that's very important that we should be giving more credence to, actually.
The plurality of voices, I think, is what I'm most excited about this initiative, and then how it could feed into all of the other industry actors, whether they're in community, focusing on advocacy, focusing on market sort of outcomes as well. So, yeah, looking forward to see what comes next. Our closing question today, that we'll maybe just go around the room and starting with Anna, is, of all of the opportunities that are possible, recognising we've touched on a fair few of the challenges as well, which one do you think is most likely to happen in the next year that you're also most excited about? And you can have the same opportunity excitement.
Yeah, well, probably mine, and it's probably very much, influenced by where I am in the space at the moment. But looking at that multi-level governance, I think, of climate change. So bringing in actors like cities, bringing in states, into that discussion rather than it just being taken place at a federal level. And we've seen that, play out in Europe. Europe's doing that, very, very well. The EU's going straight to cities. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris went straight to the conglomeration of cities before being elected to talk about these issues as well. So, that's probably something I'm most excited about, and hopefully we can bring that into the discussion.
Richie?
I'm going to jump back to electric vehicles. And the example that most excites me is that General Motors have been a major laggard when it comes to the transition in transport. This is the same company that owned the Holden brand and shut down its manufacturing here. They're also suing, I think, the Californian government against its emission standards because it was trying to do something better. But within a month of Biden being elected, they went from being a massive laggard pushing against electric vehicles to then switching to going all electric and paying for a Super Bowl ad with Will Ferrell challenging the Norwegian government to a duel on electric vehicles. So it just shows you how quickly things can shift. And I think this will be the year where things really do shift on electric vehicles, and they will become a lot more mainstream in how Australia sees its transport future.
That was such a great ad. Would recommend checking it out on YouTube if you haven't yet. And I think also just that reminder, probably most businesses have plan B in case the government gets in that's really ambitious on climate, and we need to start lifting our game rather than suing governments. Luke, what excites you?
So the last decade or so has been really focused on the transition in the electricity system, and we've sort of touched on it over the course of the conversation, but the kind of the pathways for particular sectors of the economy, whether you're talking about buildings or industry or resources or ag or transport, they've sort of been flying under the radar. And there's actually a lot of really kind of sticky challenges as well as great opportunities in each of those sectors. And we just haven't been dealing with them at all because we've been so interested in that renewables coal dynamic. As that resolves itself, I'm starting to see a lot of really amazing work actually working with those industries and those communities, actually charting a pathway forward, whether it's in terms of jobs or technology or, non-energy emissions, which is obviously a really big chunk of the puzzle that we need to solve. And that's good for policymakers going to the kind of the information base that policymakers need to be able to draw on to be able to make decisions and move the ball forward. But it's also good for building the coalition of people that are interested in moving this conversation forward, because when the conversation's very high level, it's really hard for people that aren't directly connected to say, being a solar panel installer, say, what the hell does this mean for my job? What does this mean for my family? What does this mean for my business? But as we go through sort of charting those pathways and having those chats at a more granular level, you're actually starting to create little communities of practice around what we need to do over the next decade. And it just makes it that much easier to do what we all agree needs to happen, which is to put those policies in place.
Yeah, that's great. And Jackie?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to tell you something that has to happen in the law. But I'm also just reflecting on the question you asked, Anna, before about next generation, a next generation of climate researchers. And what gets me most excited, in fact, in the area that I work in, which is the law, and more generally in this interdisciplinary space, is how much our young people are engaging on climate at the moment. And we're particularly seeing that with some of the social movements that are led by young people, by fantastic groups that are bringing litigation against some of the big players in the system, Indigenous-led groups like the Seed Mob, who are taking forward issues of Indigenous climate justice. That really excites me and gives me hope for the future. I have 2 young children. I want to see a world where they can survive and thrive. I want my young colleagues and my early career researchers and all the wonderful PhD students and students, including Luke, who I've seen through the many years, thrive in our climate future. And that gives me hope and excitement that young people are really engaged with this issue and will help drive policy forward.
Yes, so very much true. And as a non-lawyer, I don't think I've ever been so fascinated with the law because of all of the litigation opportunities that, both communities are taking forward against governments, businesses all around the world, and the outcomes as well, like just not something that I think I ever thought was possible in that sort of David and Goliath type battle. Well, thank you all so much for participating today, sharing your thoughts on how this upcoming summit in the US next month is potentially going to be a real game changer for how we start to respond in Australia, because we're slowly getting really boxed into company that we don't necessarily want to keep in terms of who's not acting on climate. And there's plenty of opportunities that we've just discussed today, from electrification, renewable energy, retrofitting of buildings, electric vehicle opportunities. The list sort of goes on and on. So thank you very much for participating today. And thank you to all of our listeners as well for tuning in. If you're interested in more of the University of Melbourne's work on climate change, you can go onto our website and catch a podcast recording of our first climate conversation. You can catch some of the sessions from the recently launched Melbourne Climate Futures that we discussed today, and sign up to our email newsletter to find out about our next climate conversation. Thanks.